Griffith Stadium was home to the Homestead Grays, and it also has a deep connection with gospel and blues legend Rosetta Tharpe. Here to tell us more is Gayle Wald, author of the book, Shout, Sister, Shout, the untold story of rock and roll trailblazer, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You know what? Before we get into our discussion, I want to make some news here on the Rock Newman Show. Elvis Presley was not the originator of rock and roll. Neither was Chuck Berry. Little Richard has often said that he came before Elvis Presley, so he wasn't the originator either. Neither was Jerry Lee Lewis. I want you to take a look right now at who was the real originator and what we'll call from this day forward, the queen of rock and roll. Let's take a look.
Up above my head, I hear music in the air. Up above my head, there is music in the air. Up above my head, music in the air. And I really do believe joy somewhere. All in my room, music everywhere. All in my home, music in the air. Up above my head, that is music.
That was one bold, full of life, larger than life woman.
Yes.
What made you so interested that you have produced this incredible book?
So I saw that clip maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I was like, who is that? And how come I've never heard of her?
Yeah.
And then when I asked around, I wasn't the only one who had never heard of her.
Yeah.
So I just started digging. And the book came out in 2007. And I was lucky to be able to talk. There was very, very little written about her that was preserved. And I was able to talk to the last people who were alive who knew her, worked with her before they died. So, yeah, so it was important to get that oral history, those memories.
Yeah. And Rosetta Tharpe passed away in 1957.
No, she was 57 in 1973.
73,
yeah.
I'm sorry. She's 57 years old. She passed away.
Yeah, in 1973 in Philadelphia.
In 1973. And unfortunately, like too many of the entertainers of that era, she really passed away in some misery.
Yeah, I don't see her story as incredibly tragic. She died of probably a stroke related to diabetes. So she had that illness, and she had a leg amputated toward the end of her life and was still performing. The thing that makes her look tragic is that no one ever purchased her a gravestone. So she had a funeral. People attended the funeral. Her friends in the gospel world in Philadelphia came to that funeral. But a gravestone never was purchased. But I don't see her life as tragic, which is one of the reasons I think she's an attractive figure, because we have all these stories about these tragic women performers, and I think she had a great career. And she was never defined by any particular man who controlled her, or she had a great career.
Well, she was a force, absolute force of nature. When I mentioned, some misery, because of her personality, because of her larger than life persona and the way that she behaved, she reminded me of what I'm going to say is a sort of a current day similarity. Was Dick Gregory. It didn't matter if Dick Gregory got in $5 million this weekend. A couple of weekends from now, he was going to be broke, because by and large, he would just give most of it away. And I think from all that I've been able to gather about her, she really lived in a way where she was extraordinarily generous.
Yes.
And
there's a story about her seeing Little Richard at a club when maybe he wasn't even, he was Richard. And giving him $20 and saying, you're going to go far, keep on working on it. So, that story itself is, exemplary. She was generous.
Okay, so take us into the life of this yet to be appreciated and unrecognized legend.
So she was born in a little town called Cotton Plant, Arkansas, in 1915. Her parents split up when she was little. She was raised, this is important, she was raised in the Church of God in Christ. And so she came up at a time and in a church where she was encouraged to use her musical gift because her community understood it as a gift. She was encouraged to use that to develop it and to express herself not just on like a piano, although she played piano, but also on a guitar. And her mother was a mandolin player, and mother and daughter moved to Chicago, so they're part of that great migration in the 20s, moved to Chicago, and so from a very early age, she became kind of a star, a celebrity in her church. She was part of a prominent Church of God, 40th Street Church of God in Christ in Chicago. And mother and daughter went on the road. So she developed her style. She kind of had to learn how to, she was, you know, as a performer in the church and also as an evangelizer with her mother, she had to learn to use that gift to really get people interested, because that was the point of evangelizing, to really get people drawn in. So she developed, you know, she learned how to sing without microphones, and she developed this finger picking style on her guitar that also was like visually interesting and exciting to watch. And that was the beginning of her development until she found herself in New York, not really found herself, until she made a decision to move to New York City and then started appearing on stages. But that was not the trajectory that was expected of her. She was married at that point. She was supposed to stay married and in the church. So going in 1939, 1938, she goes to New York City and she's on the stage of the Cotton Club and she plays at the Savoy Ballroom and she performs with Cab Calloway. That was not what a sanctified girl was supposed to be doing with her gift. Life magazine ran a picture of her that said she was a swinger of spirituals, that she would play Saturday night and also Sunday morning. So she was a little bit of a controversial figure for straddling. And we know a lot of people do that straddling, but she was really the first person to bring gospel music, which was still new in the 30s, to bring gospel music to a wider audience outside the church and also on recordings. So she was really, even before Mahalia Jackson, who outshined her and they were friends, who became more famous than she was like gospel's first superstar. And then, you know, eventually, I argue in the book, although it's, you know, we could play the game about who invented this or whatever, but I think there's a strong claim to be made that, you know, the energy, a lot of the, you can see this in her performance, the energy of rock and roll, it's extroverted, the loudness of it, the style of it, that all of that was being deeply influenced by what was going on in particularly Pentecostal churches.
And she was someone who was so effervescent. And had, again, I'm going to say that larger than life personality. Where you don't get the sense at all that she's apologizing for anything. She's out there, and she would make a joke about saying that, you know, they would say, oh, she plays the guitar good for a woman. And she would be like, yeah, for a woman, let me show you. And then go on, I mean, to just set the places on fire.
The men used to be, you know, there's stories about the men used to be afraid to come after her. Because they didn't want to be shown up by a woman. And she would, they played like her. But she would get that. You play good for a woman.
And you, and I can't imagine that this wasn't something that she, where she wanted to put her stamp, where you see old videos of men, choirs backing her up, and her just out there doing her thing, and they're all supporting her.
And in a way, I mean, it's not clear like who her influences would have been on as a guitarist. And she would have been that generation of guitarists who moved from acoustic to electric. So that would have been in the late 30s or early 40s. She starts recording on electric guitar. And a lot of people who were strumming on guitar didn't know how to use an electric instrument. It did different things because she had this finger picking style, and it was unconventional, and trained players were like, how did you do this? She didn't use a fret. So trained guitarists, which I'm not, you know, will say, oh, she had an unusual way of playing. But she was able to translate that to electric guitar and like figure out its voice in a way that preceded the way that we see like the electric guitar as like the quintessential voice of rock music.
You know, I was struck by an article because part of what comes through is her, what I'm going to say, she had like a groundbreaking personality. And one of the articles starts off as describing her as someone who was so proficient at what she did, but who lived sort of a life of loving and generosity. And when they described that life of loving, they talked about her long relationship with Mary Knight, who it was generally assumed that she had a very personal, intimate relationship with long before anything was remotely thought to be accepted of people of the same sex having a relationship. And it was as if she strutted forward very nobly all the time without any apologies for that.
Yeah. I think like a lot of blues women, a lot of women in music, she led an unconventional life for a woman.
Yeah.
She never had domesticity. She was always on the road.
Yeah.
She never had her own children, and I don't know whether that was by choice or not by choice, but she didn't, you know, I think that life, that being on the road, that unconventional life, a lot of artists, you know, are able to pursue unconventional paths for themselves because they're already in a world that's so outside of what right, she was supposed to settle down and be a mother.
Sure. Sure.
And so and in fact, her mother traveled with her whole life. Her mother was her best friend, was her first teacher, and was a kind of strict figure, but her mother, Katie Bell Newman, was always beside her, always supporting her daughter. So she got a lot of strength from her mother, and mother and daughter were out there. But yeah, the Marie Knight story is an interesting one. She discovered Marie Knight in Newark. Marie Knight was from Newark, a gospel singer, and she saw her singing on a program and thought, oh, she'd be good with me.
Yeah.
And so she asked her, you know, that day after the concert, I want you to go on the road with me. Marie said yes. And at that point, Rosetta Tharpe had her own bus that she used to travel. It said Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Decca recording artist. And partly the bus was, you know, a practicality to get through the South.
Sure.
She had a white driver, you know, who could pick up food for the people on the bus, that kind of thing, when they were traveling through the South. So Marie, and anyway, Rosetta and Marie made an extraordinary duo, and the two of those women performed throughout the country in the late 40s and early 50s, and there's not many female duets. They were amazing together, and they made some beautiful records. Marie Knight was alive when I was working on the book, so I was able to talk to her several times. And in fact, then she went back in the recording studio and put out some music. And so Marie Knight had a second act really late in her life, in her 70s or 80s. She would never say how old she was, in her 70s or 80s.
You know, and so when I say like groundbreaking persona and personality, she lived that. One example of that was the neighborhood in which she moved into, and the home that she bought in Richmond, which was in an all-white section. Yeah,
she bought a home, and she was proud of that home. It was the first home she lived. They had a big, according to, I mean, I visited the home and it had changed, but they had a big shed, like one of those cedar sheds, to keep Marie and Rosetta's furs and their gowns and all, and their wigs and all of that stuff, and it had mirrored ceilings.
I was about to say she was a showman. No, she was a showwoman.
She was. There's no word for that.
That's right.
In fact, when I was, as a writer, you think, is there a word for show woman? What do you do with that word? We don't have a word in English that means a woman who's charismatic like that on stage. But she was, exactly. Yeah. So she had this Richmond home. She eventually lost that home, and her next home was in Philadelphia, also kind of a historic home. There's a plaque in front of her home now in Philadelphia on Master Street.
Right.
But she was part of a kind of from the ground up early development for middle class African Americans in Philadelphia in the early '60s. She was one of the first investors in that neighborhood.
And so she had some very interesting experiences there in Richmond. One of them was going to a department store where she was doing some shopping and getting accosted.
Right, that's right. She went shopping, so the store was Thalheimer's, famous, so anyone from Richmond knows that store.
Absolutely.
And it was in fact where she got her wedding dress. And she was shopping there, and she bought some things in cash, and they didn't believe that she could possibly be legitimately buying that stuff. And
they didn't believe that she, a black woman, could be doing that.
And could have that much cash to buy that clothes. She worked her way out of that one. But yeah, and there's a great story about, you know, she bought a wedding dress at Thalheimer's, and someone told me the story about remembering that when she got married in Washington, D.C., that dress was driven up from Thalheimer's for her, and a white woman buttoned her into that dress.
Oh, I was going to say, we want to talk about that.
Boy.
We want to talk about that wedding.
And the other people had never seen that happen.
Yeah.
You know?
So when I use that term, you know.
In 1950, in 1951.
Yeah, when I talk about that term, a showwoman, as opposed to saying a showman, part of that was exemplified by this incredible event in Washington, D.C., where she performed and had a wedding at the same time.
She did.
So we're gonna come back to that. But the irony of her having gotten arrested at Thalheimer's, and then Thalheimer's sending up the seamstress to show the white seamstress to come up to Washington, D.C. and dress this black woman in 1951.
And 50 buttons, you know, little buttons.
All these buttons and all these sequins and all of that for the largest wedding in Washington, D.C.
That's right. That's right. So she had, she was kind of at a crossroads in her career around 1950. And she decided she was going to, with the help of some promoters in D.C., she was going to do a big thing. Yeah. And that meant going to find a husband and staging a wedding at Griffith Stadium. It was, the numbers are probably 15 or 20,000 people showed up. They brought gifts. They brought televisions. They brought linens. They brought china. They paid admission tickets to get in to see her. She had her backing group. At that point she had an all-female backing group called the Rosettes, some young women from Richmond. They were her flower girls. She had Marie Knight as her maid of honor. So she had all of the musical people. Lucky Millender, who was a well-known band leader who had worked with her in the 40s, he was up there on stage, like kind of constituting the wedding party. And then she played her guitar in her wedding dress from center field. And I thought, well, that's really badass in rock and roll. And if you think about rock and roll, and even that whole idea of it's transgressive. Sure. You know, this is way before the Beatles came to Shea Stadium, or when we think about stadium rock. And she filled a stadium in 1951. And Ebony did a giant, 7 or 8 page spread about it, and Decca recorded it and released this thing. It's called the Wedding Album. So it was a kind of a pun. So, the whole thing released, and you hear the preacher marrying them. It was a well-known Kojic minister from D.C. There's a street named after him now. He married them. So it's a great D.C. story. A great day and evening in Washington, D.C. for sure. So that was 1951. So she, to some extent, fell on some hard times. Right. And she went abroad. Yeah. For those of you who are watching, look, I'm going to encourage all of you. If you want to understand the origination of R&B, in reality, you can't do it. You cannot. It comes through this woman right here. It comes through Sister Rosetta Tharpe. We'll talk a little bit in a moment about what is a modern day honor that is about to be bestowed. But I'm going to encourage you to, this is a great book that Gayle has done here. But if you look at a couple of videos, and you'll see this one video of her in England, and she pulls up in this horse and carriage up to a train depot, and she is helped off the carriage and struts onto the stage and straps up and starts singing. The train tracks are right here. She's just over the train tracks, and the audience is lined up across from the train track, and she rocked England. She did. And what's significant about that footage is from the mid-60s, and it was filmed for British TV, and they remade this defunct railroad station into something that they thought looked like an American thing. I want to point out that she gets off of that, this is a woman who had furs in her own bus, and she gets off of this you know, like a horse and buggy, and they've got like chickens on the set. So it's a little weird. They're kind of doing this like southern thing, or rural thing, because it's blues. So it's she's framed that way. But yeah, she's wearing this like kind of the moment, like amazing coat, like this cape, and these high heel shoes, and it's raining a little bit, and she takes out this white guitar, and I mean, the thing that's, I think, important about that is that if you look at the kids who are watching that, they're kids. It was a new generation. The people in Europe, and especially in England, but also in Europe, they hadn't had a chance to ever see any of the African-American musicians that they had been listening to from imports. And that was because they couldn't travel to, there were bans on travel to England after the war. So when she came there in 1957, when she first performed in England, and then after that, it was a big deal for these audiences. It was a younger audience than she would have had in the U.S. in 1964, when kids were not listening to gospel anymore. Most kids were looking to something different. This is the age of Motown.
So in all of your research, have you come across, well-known, well-named musicians who have acknowledge that her play and her style had influence with them?
And Little Richard noted her. This is what we just like have noted, you know, not even like it's in writing. It's you can find evidence for it. So I'm sure there's other stuff that's in oral history. Elvis Presley talked about her. She was one of his favorites. Johnny Cash. When Johnny Cash passed away, Roseanne Cash said that Rosetta Tharpe was his favorite singer. Bob Dylan has spoken about her. It's a pretty good, you know, a lot of the men associated with the British invasion. She toured with a really young Ginger Baker of Cream when she was in England. So all that generation of musicians, Eric Clapton, they knew about her. They would have been looking at her and studying her like they were studying all the blues musicians and most of the male musicians to figure out, like, how do you do this? How do we do this? How do we translate this? So she was incredibly important to the British invasion. And that's a way that her music got retranslated for another generation.
And coming back on this side of the ocean, someone who had so much influence on, you know, the British performers was Chuck Berry. And you see in Rosetta Tharpe's performances, one, the way she's picking, and two, the way she's starting to get down. And when I say get down, I'm talking about starting to bend down. Chuck Berry made the duck walk famous.
That's right.
He got that duck walk in part from Rosetta Tharpe, who couldn't get all the way down there because
she's wearing a long gown.
A long
How are you
gown
supposed to get down?
And high heels, yes. But she started. I mean, just physically started to in her performance to get down there, which influenced Chuck Berry, and then of course that influence had so much to do with Keith Richards.
You see her do this like windmill thing. She takes her hands off the guitar, you know, so that for an audience you're like, whoa, is she gonna get that next note, right? So it's exciting to watch it, and you think, oh yeah, that's where that comes from. Those styles, you're like that charisma as a player, not just as a, you know, not just as a singer but just that visual charisma.
So getting deep into it as you did, how do you account for the vacuum that took place, the void of who she was and what she meant to the industry for so many years? I mean, you know, your book and some other acknowledgement is taking place, but for so many years. You mentioned Mahalia Jackson. That certainly had some impact. Mahalia just emerged, you know, and sort of went to the forefront of the consciousness in terms of popular gospel music. That's a factor. What else attributes to her being so lost?
I think, you know, I think it has everything to do with the fact that she was a black woman. You know, you see the transition from the beginning of the 60s to the beginning of the 70s, that rock and roll, which had been invented as a term to attract young white audiences, to black music and to make it safe for them to consume, safe for youth to consume.
What used to be called race music. That you see that by 1970 that has been recoded as
as music that white men make. And in 1971, when Rosetta Tharpe was still alive, a writer in England said she looked like a blacked up Elvis in drag. And that was astonishing to me to read that. She was still alive then. And so to see already the process of her being positioned as the successor to Elvis Presley, not the innovator, you know, had already was happening in her lifetime.
We live in a time where right now cultural appropriation is something that is being looked at, and it's being looked at and debated with the gentleman, the young man from Hawaii, and why can't I think of his name? Is the big entertainer.
Oh, Bruno Mars.
Bruno Mars. Cultural appropriation. Right. What the hell do you call somebody saying that she's like a dressed up Elvis, when in fact she came long before Elvis, and Elvis was impersonating her as quite opposed to the
Big Mama,
other way around.
Big Mama Thornton.
Come on with Big Mama Thornton.
And right, so what happens if we start seeing some of these white male icons as trying to capture some of the flavor of black women? We think of that as a conversation between men sometimes, but actually I think that's interesting to think about these white men also thinking about black women's performance on stage. I don't know. I mean, I think it had everything to do with the fact that she could be erased. And
what a comment. What a comment that she could be erased.
She could be erased.
Well, if she was erased, we're bringing it back to life.
We are.
Right here. Right here. And tell us about the tribute that is about to be bestowed upon her.
So she was nominated in 2017 for induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018. Usually people spend a few years on the ballot before they get in, if they ever do. She was voted right in, and she will be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in April. And she will be under the category, they have a category called Early Influences. I kind of wish she weren't just an early influence, but that's okay.
Let me tell you something. We're going to throw darts at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, because it shouldn't be just as an early influencer.
I think influence even, to me, influence even suggests that she's important because of what came after her, rather than that she's important in and of herself. But that's okay, because I think she would be, we can have a critique of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I certainly have that, but I think that she would have been really happy to have that honor. And when she, you know, would talk to interviewers in the 60s and 70s, when once they could use the word rock and roll, she was like, if you want to call it that, that's fine. I invented that too. So I think she embraced that. She, like a lot of musicians, she didn't care about those genre words. Those were marketing categories. You know, and she got pigeonholed in the 50s when Decca couldn't figure out what to do with her. They tried to make her into an R&B singer, which she was terrible at doing, like a My Man Left Me. It wasn't her personality. So you see how she was even kind of, she got pigeonholed in her career. So thank
you so much. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame people, put her in, just period, because she deserves to be here. Folks, that wraps us for this evening. For more information on this program or any other program produced by WHUT, go to WHUT.org. Goodbye and God bless.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.